Judge Ito is about to bring the proceedings to order here, so turn on your TVs and sit back and relax. If we're all in the right place, this should be the Warren Omission, where we will be discussing a number of areas where perhaps the Warren Commission did not delve as deeply as they could have. Maybe they did delve as deeply, but at least we're going to raise the possibility that they did not. And I'd like to begin with a reading from the Gospel according to Warren. This is during the testimony of Ruth Payne, the chairman, which before today is over, we're going to change a little bit, but at that time it was Earl Warren. Senator Cooper, at this time I am obliged to leave for our all-day conference on Friday at the Supreme Court, and I may be back later in the day, but if I don't, you continue, of course. Senator Cooper, I will this morning. If I can't be here this afternoon, whom do you want to preside? Chairman, Congressman Ford, would you be here this afternoon at all? Representative Ford, unfortunately, Mr. McCloy and I have to go out of town to a conference. The chairman, you are both going out of town, aren't you? Senator Cooper, I can go and come back if it is necessary. The chairman, I will try to be here myself. Will Mr. Dulles be here? Mr. McCloy, he is out of town. The chairman, if you should not finish, Mr. Jenner, will you please phone me at the court and I will try to suspend my own conference over there and come over. Senator Cooper, I will be here anyway all morning and will try to come back this afternoon. The chairman, thank you very much. I think Gary Shaw summed this up in the most articulate sentence I've ever read about this kind of situation when he said, even a common chicken thief is allowed the privilege of having the entire jury present before he's found guilty. We have a number of interesting panelists this morning. We will begin with the gentleman to my right, Mr. Russ McLean. I'm not going to tell you very much about what he's done because he will be telling you that. What I will tell you is that when he has done the work he's done, he'll be explaining step one to you. Step two has traditionally to this point been when he's done doing what he's done, he puts all the material that he's gathered in envelopes and mails it to anyone that has literally requested it. Fortunately, so far the number has been small. And I can tell you there were days when my postman has had to make, postperson, when the person that delivers the mail has had to make 2 trips from the truck to my door for things that Russell has sent me, thanklessly. And if we had 150 researchers in this community that have done the kind of work that Russell has done and never put their name on an article, we might be a little bit closer to the truth. So I'd ask you to please listen carefully to Russ McLean.
Thank you. If we could indulge me just a moment, I'd like to ask, in the past month we lost probably one of the more important witnesses in the assassination. Harold Norman, who is a witness on the 5th floor along with Bonnie Ray Williams and Junior Jarman, died about a month ago suddenly, and within a week also lost his wife. Until this time, Harold had never told his story publicly, but Walt and I, among others, had been working with him, and he seemed to be to the point of where he was ready to reveal some things that maybe no one else knew or had come out before. So if we could please have a moment of silence, I'd appreciate it. Thank you. In examining the Warren Commission's case against Lee Harvey Oswald, probably the greatest omission in the so-called official investigation is almost total disregard for much of the first day evidence, much of which now is contained in the Dallas City Archives, not 5 miles from here. First made available in 1989, the archives went largely unnoticed by the research community until their formal release by the Dallas City Council in 1992. Now, compared to the recent meetings of the Assassination Records Review Board, these materials are instantly obtained if you consider 2-hour blocks of time, 25 cents a copy, and $5 to $9 a photograph, a bargain. In light of the massive campaign by the print and the electronic media in support of the lone assassin theory advanced by the Warren Commission, this evidence that's found in the Dallas City Archives cast a serious doubt on the findings and conclusions of the Warren Commission.
You want me to run your overhead while you...
Yeah, it's good.
This is where we
Yeah,
start?
just start with that. Now, I promised I wouldn't get into any Posner bashing, and I won't. What we have here is just a little bit, and I'll illustrate with the disregard that a lot of the early testimony is taken. And even Posner says it himself on page 235, that testimony closer to the event must be given greater weight, that any changes or additions made years later, when the witness's own memory is often muddied or influenced by television programs, films, books, and discussions with others. Okay. This is the first known statement of Lee Bowers, the man in the railroad tower. And if you notice, he gives a general description of the 3 cars that he sees. It's that last one, yeah. And then after the last car leaves, you notice, about 8 or 10 minutes later, after he left, I heard, and he starts to say 3 shots, but notice, he scratches that out and replaces it with at least 3 shots, very close together, never specifying whether he heard 3, 4, or however many. But then when you contrast with what he said before the Warren Commission, notice, I heard 3 shots. 1, then a slight pause, then 2 very close together, also reverberating from the shots. Were you able to form an opinion as to the source of the shots, from which direction? Either came from the school book depository or the mouth of the triple underpass. Then, can you tell me now, after he had determined how long he had been in the tower, could you tell me how long or from where the shots came? No, I could not. Quite interesting. Then when we look at the statement of another first-aid witness, Marion Baker, 1. Describing how he and Mr. Truly entered the depository. Okay. Determine how they, well, let's see. How they entered the depository. Go ahead and change that. He describes, now this goes on and describes about the, how they entered, describes that Oswald was wearing a light brown jacket when he discovered him on the 2nd floor 90 seconds after the last shot. When it has already been well established that Oswald in fact wore a blue jacket to work that day. And in witness descriptions of the man in the window had no jacket. In fact, it testified that he had an open neck shirt, light colored. Now, if we go to the testimony of Bonnie Ray Williams, one of the witnesses on the 5th floor.
This was Baker's.
Okay, let's go ahead and go with Baker's then. I'm sorry.
This is, I think, where you can get a jacket.
Right. Now we know with Baker. Did you notice what clothes the man was wearing as he came down? At that particular time, I was looking at his face, and it seemed to me like he had a light brown jacket on and maybe some kind of white-looking shirt. And he said, even if he noticed that it was kind of dim in there, it still was hanging out to the side. He's still able to tell there's the light brown jacket. And he describes as he sees him later, he never saw him in the lineup, but he did see that that was a man on the second floor and that he was wearing a jacket.
Deer hunting and...
The deer hunting, yeah. And it's interesting when they asked Baker, and I think Walt referenced this the other day when he was talking about the trained pigeons and the deer hunting. They asked him, "You ever go deer hunting?" "Yes." "And have you had an occasion to hear shots from your own rifle?" "No, the guy enjoys going out and sitting at a deer stand in 30-degree weather and freezing to death." Is it from other rifles? Of course not. There are several other idiots like Marion Baker. Okay, now let's go to...
Timing?
Yeah. Baker does testify to hearing 3 shots, but if you notice, they ask him spaced out over what? 3 seconds apart. From the first shot? Yes. 3 seconds from the first to the second, and another 3 seconds from the second to the third. You're saying not over 3 seconds. Now, I may not know math too well, but it looks to me like that adds up to be at least 6 seconds, well over this 5.6 established by the Zapruder film. Yeah. Now we go to the Posner's description of Bonnie Ray Williams, Jr., Jarman, and Harold Norman. It said during the assassination, they were on the southeast corner of the 5th floor, and since the flooring was being replaced, they say there was only a thin plywood covering with cracks in the planks, allowing some light between the floors. Sounds passed easily. There are numerous cartons of books on that floor in the Texas School Book Depository, the average weight of which is 55 pounds. Now, if this is a thin plywood floor, they're not going to let a man up there, much less put all these heavy boxes, unless you like things falling on your head. Now, if we go to Bonnie's first statement, he describes, "I heard 2 shots. It sounded like they came just above us. We ran to the west side of the building." Now, I'll get to the significance of this "ran to the west side" statement here in a second. They discussed that they didn't see anyone or hear anyone above them or on the stairs. Let me go to the second page there. And he describes how they ran down the building there, and it describes how Oswald was there when they got to work and how long he had been working there.
You want the testimony?
Yeah. But yet, when we look at his testimony, how many shots did you hear fired? "I heard 3 shots, but at first I told the FBI I heard only 2. They took me down because I was excited and I couldn't remember too well. But later on, as everything began to die down, and I got my memory back a little better than the 22nd. Now stop and think for a moment. You're an African-American man in Dallas in 1963. The Sheriff's Department, the Dallas Police Department, and you've got officers from the federal government fly you to Washington, take you into a room and say, "You heard this?" You say, "Yes, sir, boss. Yes, sir, boss. I heard this." "Yes, sir." You're going to say anything they want you to say. "Did you hear anything upstairs at all?" "No, sir, I didn't hear anything." "Any footsteps?" "No, but we were running too, and that was making a louder noise." We'll get to that in a second. It says, "We really ran?" "Yes, sir, we really ran, and that was probably making a lot of noise." Kind of strange if they're running to the west end of the building. Can they not see or hear Oswald supposedly coming down the stairs from the 6th floor? Okay. Now on that, and running down the stairs, when they describe here laying of the new floor, The only reason why there were some employees still there, that things were slowing down, is that they were laying a new floor on the 6th floor. In fact, it was an oak floor, and that plywood was being laid down over the top of it. Now, they completed the 5th floor and hadn't completed the 6th floor, but only a little portion of it. You would wonder, wouldn't they hear a man running on the floor? And for those of you that have been on the 6th floor, if you notice the stairwell back over in the corner, as you come off the stairs, you're exposed on the landing of the 5th floor before you go around and get on the other side of the staircase. Even if they could not see him, could they hear him running down to that side of the building? Okay, go ahead. He asked, could you see light from the 5th floor to the 6th floor as you look above your window? Well, at that time, that day of November, I did not notice that, but the other day when you were questioning me, even after the thick new floor, it was put over the old floor where you could still see light. Definitely strange. Again, he asked, and they asked again, Mr. Ball asked, did you run fast towards the west floor? Yes, we did. We moved rather fast. Something doesn't jibe here. Does Oswald get to the 5th floor? Or as we have discovered in this case, Oswald was a man of many special talents. Go ahead. Okay, no, go ahead. Again, they asked Mr. Williams, did you hear anyone going up or down the stairs? No, I did not. Did we pay any attention to that? No, sir. How could you not pay attention to it? You hear any movement up above? No, sir. And notice here, were you paying any attention? No, sir, we weren't paying any attention. Again, how could you not be? Okay, we've already gone through that. Yeah.
And I missed it.
No, that's okay. Go ahead and go to positive description of it. And again, we're going to reference here Gerald Posner's description of two key witnesses on Houston Street. However, there is consistent testimony of a man in the window who saw a man in the window, Robert Edwards and Ronald Fisher, both describing a man in the window. Said they were on Houston and Elm, directly in front of the depository. They described the sniper's nest, and then the figure both men described sounded remarkably like Oswald. They give a description there. Now let's go to there. But however, when we look at their statements, it paints a slightly different picture. Now they notice the description is the same, but notice in comparison to what Marion Baker said, they do not describe the man as wearing a jacket. The motorcade rounded the corner about this time, and then I thought I heard 4 shots, but it never occurred to us what it was. Now when you look at Edwards' testimony before the Warren Commission, did he have anything in his hand at all that you could see? No. How many shots did you hear, if you remember? Well, I heard 1 more than was fired. Now, Bellin backs off here and says, you mean on the affidavit you heard 4 shots? I still right now don't know how many was fired. If I said 4, then I thought I heard 4. Now what you want to look at here is, if you pay particular attention to this testimony, what I've seen in the Warren Commission, this runs consistent throughout. Any witness that brought any testimony or any evidence contrary to what the official line was to be, they shut them down quick. It was like, thank you, goodbye, we'll see you. However, you had witnesses like Howard Brennan and others that were consistent with what they were looking for. They let them go on and on about everything. You notice, he says, he introduces his affidavit here. Now, we don't know what affidavit this is exactly. But it says, in the affidavit, you said that shots seemed to come from the building there. Did you really say that or not? No, I did not say that. And you notice, anything else that you can think of? No.
Cutoff time.
Okay.
That's what they did.
Then we look at Fisher. Notice you looked up at the window, and I noticed that he seemed to be laying down or in a funny position. Yes, he had an open neck shirt. Again, no jacket. And that before the motorcade rounded the corner, that he had been in that position. And I thought what I heard was 3 shots, and the motorcade was about where the Stemmons Freeway sign is. Now, if we go to his Warren Commission testimony, one of the things he says is that, well, as I looked around, I thought I heard a shot and thought it was a firecracker. And then the second shot, and everyone from where I was standing, they started to scatter. They asked, at first I thought there were 4, but as I think about it more, there must have been just 3. Again, at first you thought there were 4 shots? Yes. Now we look and ask, where did the shots appear to be coming from? From just west of the school book depository building, there were some railroad tracks and there were some cars back there. Witnesses on the north end of Dealey Plaza, or the east end of Dealey Plaza, hearing shots from the grassy knoll. And they appeared to be coming from these railroad cars. Well, the area somewhere. David Bellin, a man of supreme intelligence. Now if we go to, and they ask him again, all right, I'm going to call, he introduces the Fisher Deposition Exhibit number 1 and asks him to read from the statement and indicate what doesn't appear to be accurate. Notice what Fisher says, that is correct. So it's quite interesting there. He says, the statement says that you saw him in the window. Did you know how far the window was open? Said the window was open almost all the way. But then a lot of the indication is that the window was half closed when it was discovered on the 6th floor. Go ahead. Michael Payne. Now, Ruth Payne's husband, Michael Payne, in his first, one of his first statements, says that I thought it unlikely that he shot the president and that the FBI was well aware of his presence there. Early doubts. Notice he thought it was unlikely. Now notice the statement of Charles Hester. Charles Hester and his wife was located at the east end of the pergola. And I have to thank Hal Verb for that, because when I asked about where was his testimony in the Warren Commission, well, if we could put that one up there for just a second. Yeah, just put it up for just a second, please. Asked about his testimony before the Warren Commission, guess what? There was none. When you look, he describes where we say in the grass on the slope along Elm Street where the park is located. Notice he says he heard 2 shots ring out. They sounded like they came from immediately behind us and over our heads. Well, immediately behind and over their heads on the east end of the pergola would indicate in the parking lot or in the railroad yard, not from the depository. Okay, go ahead. Now, this, I didn't know that this, when I first discovered this document from J. Edgar Hoover, dated November 23rd, this is in Jesse Curry's personal JFK assassination file. There's a copy or two, I think, that's still left over at the Ask Mart. But since it's been out of print, I don't think it was, this was the first I had discovered of it. Notice we just described the receipt of evidence from the Dallas police. Notice that Q1 is a bullet from the stretcher, obviously, which has to be the magic bullet. Now, if 2 bullets struck in the limousine, now let's look at what they've got. A bullet fragment from the right front seat, number 1. From beside the front seat, number 2. Metal fragment from the president's head, 3 and 4. And let's see, 5, 6, and 7, 3 metal fragments from the rear floorboard carpet, a scraping made from the inside surface of the windshield. You have 7 or 8 fragments, recognizable fragments from 1 bullet. A lot of fragments for 1. Okay, go ahead, no, walk. Go to the next one.
What page?
Yeah, I had that page right there. Notice, no latent prints of value were developed in Oswald's revolver. The cartridge cases, the unfired cartridge, the clip in the rifle, of which we do not find any record in the property list or any of the photographs, or the inner parts of the rifle. How can he load the rifle without leaving fingerprints on something? Go ahead. Now go with this whole pain search. Yeah. No, just go ahead and go with the pain search right there. Just that one page will be fine. I'm just gonna. Something else is unique to the Dallas City Archives. This is the first written search of Ruth Payne's house. Notice the photographic equipment, the Kodachrome roll, camera timer, camera in case, small undescribed German camera in a black case. Go to the next one. A flash attachment. Quite a lot of photographic equipment for a man that supposedly was so frugal with his spending. All right, now here's the police lab crime search scene from the police archives. Notice 1 live round, 2 spent holes. Where did the 3rd one go? Will Fritz made a statement after he had testified from the Warren Commission, said that he kept the 3rd one for comparison purposes. Comparisons to what? Now, I don't proclaim to be a law enforcement officer, but that would seem to me to be called something withholding evidence. Go ahead. Notice in all the descriptions, such as a letter, promise to repay financial assistance for the loan to come back from Russia, all these other things, The one thing I don't see there is any mention of any type of gloves or anything that would keep him from putting any kind of fingerprints on the rifle or on the ammunition loaded in the rifle. What's that? Yeah. Now we look into statements of when Oswald was arrested. Notice that Paul Bentley says that they received a call about 1:40 p.m. to 10th and Patton. Minutes later, the call came out that the shooting suspect was in the Texas Theater. When you look at the arrest report filled out at 1:40 by Nick McDonald, it stated that Oswald had already been charged with the murder of the president. From the Dallas police, from the radio traffic, notice at 1:40, they want to know about the 400 block that they're fixing to move in to check it down with the suspects. Is that the one involved in the shooting of the officer? Yes, we already have him. Has serious doubts on the timing of when Oswald actually was arrested. Statement here, this is of concerning the arrest of Lee Harvey Oswald. This is from, I believe, Bob Carroll. Go to that last page. Yeah. Notice it says, when they fought for the pistols, I released the pistols, Sergeant Jerry Hill. Looking at the FBI report, there are no fingerprints on Oswald's gun, when supposedly he had just shot J.D. Tippett and had tried to pull the gun to shoot Nick McDonald. Very strange. Cunningham. This is E.L. Cunningham, another Dallas police officer, said the suspect was going to the public library at Marsalis. Who is this? Who is this suspect? Who are they chasing? Go ahead.
Second page?
No, go ahead. Gerald Hill. This is Gerald Hill's statement in which they marked the gun for identification purposes. The pistol was released to Detective Baker, which indicates there's another person handling the gun. And it kind of taints the evidence there. Go ahead.
Lion?
What's that?
Lion?
Yeah, no. Yeah, go ahead. And this is Officer Lyon. And he notices that he says in this statement that Oswald kept repeating, "Why am I being arrested? Why am I being arrested?" In fact, at his news conference that evening, he stated, that he said, "I've only been charged with the murder of a police officer." When you look at the arrest report, he's already been charged with the murder of the president. Never told why he's been arrested. Go ahead. Again, this is a statement of Officer Taylor, in which a crowd was gathered outside of the arrest, shouted, "Kill him, let us kill him." Why?
No.
Now, we have been told by Will Fritz and others in the Dallas Police Department that no notes of any kind were made of Oswald's interrogation. Notice when you look at this page 5 of interrogation of Oswald, notes in the margin. Now go ahead. But when you look at the Warren Commission, It's completely different.
Same page. Same page. Sanitize. Hey. Small guys. No, it's dragging all along. It's going to be this hard.
Yeah. There was also photographic evidence, too. Note, the caption on this photograph is police evidence sent to the FBI. Notice, 2 spent holes, only 2 of the slugs, 1 of the unfired cartridge. Again, where did the 3rd cartridge go? Whoa. The Mannlicher Carcano, notice, no clip in the rifle. This is along the south wall of the Texas School Book Depository. Notice the various amounts of books stacked in and around. Quite an obstacle, of course, for a man to get to the exact opposite corner and hide the rifle and down 4 flights of stairs in 90 seconds. The stairwell. How can Oswald pass 2 witnesses, Victoria Adams and Sandra Stiles, and them not see him? And how can he come off the landing on the 5th floor, pass down this area, and not be seen by Jarman, Norman, or Williams? One of the backyard photographs. This was discovered recently in 1992 by 1991 or 92 by the local NBC affiliate here in Dallas. This silhouette and this one. Now this is in Bob Groden's book, The Killing of a President. But in the television story, they asked this gentleman here, why did you take these pictures? He said, on orders at the FBI. Whose orders? And again, why? The ramp at the Dallas City Jail, to which Oswald has been transferred, where he was murdered, the testimony of Roy Vaughn, in which he stated Pierce's car came up the ramp, and at that time Ruby was supposed to have gone down. We measured this ramp last year, and it's 8 feet 11 inches wide. Now, 60s model car is awfully wide, and if that car is coming up that ramp, Jack Ruby's not the thinnest man in the world. He's certainly not going to get down. Now, these documents are only a sample of what is instantly available to us as a research community. Do they prove a conspiracy in and of themselves? No. But what they do prove is this, is that the open and shut case presented to us by our government 30 years ago and recently declared closed by a well-known author is by no means that. It is a case full of contradictions and doubts that cries out for further investigation. For if we as a people do not demand it, then the very concept that this nation was founded on, an ordinary individual's freedom of speech and the ability to criticize their government without fear of reprisal, have indeed perished from the earth. Thank you.
Thank you, Russ. Having been Russell's guest this weekend, I can tell you, and I know this is true of many people in the research community, what he spoke about today is literally the tip of the iceberg. There is a great wealth of material down at the DPD archives. It's not the easiest thing in the world to access, but if you can, you will make some discoveries. Okay, our next speaker is going to be Philip Ten Brink. Philip and I have met on a couple of occasions, and he is going to be discussing, as Wallace and I are, some of the, again, specific areas where the Warren Commission, not as in this case where they ignored what was in front of them, but where they had the material right in front of them and then ignored it. And I spoke to Philip at some length, and I think you'll find this presentation quite interesting. So with that, I give you Philip Ten Brink.
I'd like to begin here today to let you know the reason you're here is that you have a God-given gift of skepticism. You take everything with a grain of salt. You're not really ready to swallow something until you're really sure it's the truth. And this is a very important part in a free and open society, is the ability to question, the ability to challenge, and the ability to declare that your government must be accountable to you for all its activities. When you begin with a man like Earl Warren to head the commission to investigate an assassination, you're dealing with an individual who was responsible for the denial of civil rights and property rights to Americans of Japanese descent in World War II because there was a possibility that they could represent a security risk to the United States. And that to him was good constitutional law. So as far as I'm concerned, this abomination called the Warren Commission is probably reflective of his same ability to interpret the law. I think Lyndon Johnson, everybody really appreciated his ability and insight into the proper use of federal funds. If it was George Bush, maybe it would be we can't check up on every drive-by shooting. And as we learn as time goes on, the people who told us the truth really didn't live lives of truth. I think looking at this, from a perspective of history, men haven't changed. The same things, values, desires that guide men's lives continue now as they did 2,000 years ago. People just don't change. Two old Roman quotes, silence implies consent. How many people involved today in prominent positions still will not speak a word? Even if you can get them to admit in private they think something's not right, they will not say anything in public. They're fearful. And when many are guilty, the offense goes unavenged. And in this particular area, I'm sure, Jack Kennedy had a lot of enemies. But the basic part of an investigation is to begin with motive. Who would profit or who would benefit from the death of an individual? And this is something that the Warren Commission never even attempted to do. They simply attempted to put to sleep any doubts or any discrepancies or anything that might have caused suspicion amongst the general public. It was time to give them a message of peace, dream, and sleep. Everything's okay in Washington. Basic things that don't fit into the pattern are just routinely ignored. And this is with regards to like the missed shots. Lee Harvey Oswald is portrayed as being a great marksman, but when you look at how far the missed shots missed the car, it's just truly amazing to have that kind of accountability. You have a direct headshot, and then with another shot miss the car by 50 to 75 feet. This is a picture of that bullet mark on the sidewalk, and looking back at the depository, if you can look at the angle, you see the angle of that mark doesn't even point towards the window. It points towards the west side of the building. Early on, you can see the intensity with which the Dallas Police Department tried to seal the crime scene, as they couldn't stop the flow of traffic because it would just interfere too much with the business that day. So they parked the cars on the sidewalk so traffic can continue. what you'll find is that where the cars are parked on the sidewalk, it overlies where that bullet mark was on the sidewalk. And where those men are gathered down together in a group is where there's a bullet mark that also strikes the curb and goes on to strike Mr. Tay. But these were things that they really weren't interested in looking at because, of course, these were bullets or bullet strikes that didn't have anything to do with the death of the president. Other factors that should have, marked a great deal of interest. We've all heard about the great ability of the FBI to solve crimes with just a little bit of evidence. Well, this is the white windbreaker coat that's found not far from the scene of Officer Tippett's murder. It's got a laundry mark in it, but Lee Harvey Oswald's too poor to launder his coats. So they looked in Dallas, and they said, we can't find anybody in Dallas who did this, so time to go back to Washington. Also in Officer Tippett's car, you can see in the back there a dark-colored suit coat. Now, Officer Tippett's wife has testified that that's not his coat. She doesn't know whose it is. But what in the world is he doing riding around the car with somebody else's suit coat? And why is another white coat, white windbreaker coat, found near the scene of his murder? Could it be that it's somehow related to these two men? I'm still somewhat nonplussed at why people would believe that J.D. Tippett was killed because he was an officer involved in an adulterous affair would bring discredit on the Dallas Police Department. I think it's much more likely that he was somehow involved in the transportation of these two men away from the scene. The man in the white coat is the man that has a little walkie-talkie device there, and the man that stands up and puts his fist in the air as the president responds to his shots. And this man is the man that had the umbrella and was pumping it up and down. But these are areas that the Warren Commission never really pursued. They had really no desire to identify these people, find out who they were, and what they were doing there. One of the things that really disturbed me here recently is Jackie's testimony. Mr. Ranking is interviewing her about what was heard in the back seats at the time of the shooting, and of course her response is she doesn't remember herself saying anything. She just wants to communicate to these people that she couldn't hear anything anybody said in the front seat because there was this big windshield between, I think, isn't there? And Rankin replies, yes, between the seats. Now what is he talking about, this big windshield between the seats? Was there some type of window that would go up and down, like an electric power window inside a limousine, that could go up to protect the driver from shot and go down after the event? I've never been able to see this in any pictures. But yet it's quite obvious that what she's trying to do is to bring this into the discussion about the windshield. And if you see the length of her testimony, the question stopped very soon thereafter.
31 questions.
And it didn't have much to do, or any more, with about the windshield. Here you see this is one of the bullet strikes to the chrome of the car. Now, of course, in the course of an investigation, the people you'd want to ask about this are the people who are sitting in the front seats. Could you tell us about this? What were your reactions? Do you remember seeing this? They really don't ask Greer and Kellerman about the strike and their reaction to the strike or when it occurred in the course of the shooting. They ask John Connolly about this. They don't ask Nellie. They ask John. Well, John, of course, can only remember that he was passing out at this time and doesn't have really good recollections. Here you have another picture of the presidential limousine. My concern about this photo is when this picture is taken. Is this picture taken in Dallas? Is it taken back in Washington, D.C.? But there you can see in the windshield a little starring. And then there's debate as to whether or not that's a strike from the front outside or from the rear on the inside. The fact of the matter is that there's no hole in there big enough for a bullet to pass through, but there's a small piece of the windshield missing. And the statements by the people who provided the Secret Service was the fact that the glass in the windshield's not bulletproof. Well, that appears to be bulletproof glass there. Maybe it only wasn't bulletproof around the president. Going back in history, there's many things that people model and learn from as examples of good events and bad events. In 1943, in order to light the fires of resistance in Europe, the British thought it would be a good idea to kill those people inside the Nazi command structure. And so they picked a man by the name of Reinhold Heydrich, who was like the second in command under Himmler in Czechoslovakia. And this is one of those tight hairpin curves. And just about where you would see these men standing right there is where the attack came. The reason this site is picked is that as you come into the turn, you have to brake. You're coming down a hill, you have to brake, and so once somebody begins to fire on you, you can't stop braking. You can't accelerate to escape or you lose control. There's Reinhard Heydrich's car. Like most planned assassinations, things always go wrong, and you have to plan or have contingencies. In this case, the man that was supposed to kill the Reinhard Heydrich had a submachine gun. And how would you like to be standing out there with Reinhard Heydrich coming down the street and your machine gun jams? And as you try to clear that machine gun, your buddy is armed with a grenade. And Reinhard Heydrich, as you can see, the car stopped here. Why didn't he keep going? I mean, the fellow was so arrogant, he was going to go out and shoot him for having the audacity even to try to kill him. But when he stood up in the car, a grenade was thrown which exploded outside the car and drove fragments of the car with horsehair into him, and he eventually died of peritonitis. But you find all kind of things go wrong when you plan an assassination, and you have to prepare and have contingencies to cover those little mechanical events that nobody could predict. And I think that's what we see here today as we go through and we find all these discrepancies from the story of a lone crazed nut firing 3 rounds, that something just didn't go right with the plan. And consequently, all these other things start mounting up as little discrepancies. To look deeper into this, you find that there are some individuals who's been very deeply involved with the operation, as it might be called, and they still do not clearly speak of everything that transpired. I think that from my point of view, the thing I would have been most interested in is an investigation which begins to looking at motive. Who would benefit from the death of a president? Richard Case Nagel seems to present a lot of interesting information, and his inside connections seem to suggest that this was not just a simple matter of the United States and its military establishment taking on the President of the United States. He seems to think that there was another country involved, but he wanted to emphasize that the conspiracy that he had cognizance of was not inspired by the communists. It wasn't instigated by a foreign government or representative thereof, but there may have been individuals from other countries involved. The important thing here is, as we progress in our knowledge and desire, is that if indeed there was another nation or another group of people involved, is that our concepts of law and justice suggest that the guilty party should be punished, not their families. I find it very interesting to read about the writings of Jack Ruby. Now, Lee Harvey Oswald is always portrayed as being a dumb, sociopathic, antisocial personality. But yet when you read about Jack Ruby, he's constantly talking about Nazis, master race, and fears of the future and fears for his Jewish people. But yet I never have anybody characterize him as a paranoid, Nazi-fearing person. It's like this is something that shouldn't be discussed. Ruby's testimony before the Warren Commission is about fears of his people being annihilated, fears of the future, fears about the Nazis, and fears of his own death. With respect to Kennedy and his rise to power, it's interesting to find in conversations with other foreign leaders about perspective. The important phrase, it's how others view you is very important, that you know how other people look at you. And Kennedy viewed himself as a candidate of the people, and his discussions with Khrushchev is trying to tell him that from his perspective that it was Rockefellers and other rich families that had brought him to power and that controlled him and told him what to do. And Kennedy's response is, hey, those guys didn't support me, those were Nixon fans. And Khrushchev's response is, they're very clever fellows, they know how to cover their trail. Being from Indiana is just something you have to talk about with family values. But looking back historically in time, you find some very interesting things. And sometimes I think as Americans, we have a problem almost like Mr. Magoo, our glasses are so thick and the vision and image so distorted of what we are and how others view us that we really can't get a good grasp or grip on events and how they're portrayed to us. The corporation called CBS Time Life was founded and predominantly controlled and owned by Henry Luce and Claire Booth Luce and their present descendants. And CBS has been a well-known, used source for covert activities, overseas correspondence, and photographers for various intelligence agencies. But the Luce family was known first and foremost as being virulent anti-communists. It's interesting to note that the headquarters for CBS happens to be in Rockefeller Plaza. If you go back and you look through the campaign of 1960 about change and a new generation, you'll find that these assets had all good things to say about Kennedy. Nothing new there that would suggest that they were in any way opposed to him. Time magazine in 1938 printed information from the German propaganda sources when people in America began to be concerned about this problem of Jewish relocation. Time magazine put us all to rest when they showed pictures of nice elderly Jewish couple in front of a Bavarian chalet up in the mountains. This was nice relocation, nice retirement cottages, don't be concerned. It should be remembered that in the time of World War II that Joseph Kennedy Sr., Joseph Kennedy was a Nazi supporter. He thought that the Nazis were going to be a better business deal for Americans than siding with the British, and was encouraging neutrality. He was also known for being a virulent anti-Semite. Moving on to NBC. NBC is a corporation. It's publicly owned, but it's privately controlled, and the principal shareholder is General Electric. And General Electric is owned by the Rockefeller and the Morgan families. They control the controlling interests. And both of these families have been known for both their proclivity towards socialism, where the government provides the contract and you provide the service. You don't have to have the competitors that way. You just have to influence and control the men who give the contracts. During World War II, the Rockefeller Corporation Standard Oil, even as Britain was already engulfed in the war, was selling to the Germans the high-tech ability to make the high-octane aviation fuel. When our merchant marine ships were being sunk in the Atlantic, the German submarines were being filled with diesel fuel from Standard Oil subsidiaries in South America. It wasn't until after months into the war that the fledgling OSS was able to identify this and ask the board of directors to stop this activity as it was destructive to the American war effort. It should be noticed that the first big battle between JFK and Wall Street occurred with U.S. Steel, which is again a corporation predominantly owned by the Rockefeller and Morgan families. I don't mean in any way to say that these folks are indeed Nazis, but with respect to their socialism and their activities during World War II, they would certainly share the trend that was found amongst the German socialists. Moving on to the present day, when we look at the information and the growth upon the conglomeration of the news services, you get to CNN. And if you watch the news quite closely, you'll find that increasingly you get one perspective, one film footage, that CNN will catch the news and the other stations will show the news. But the appearance is that CNN is owned by Ted Turner and he's a dominant share owner, but the board of directors really controls the corporation, and the major seats are owned by Time Warner and by General Electric. Again, the same business families control the influence of that media. Going back in time, one area that really never is explored is, Jack Kennedy certainly was perceived in our country by individuals as being a threat to security because of his failure to take a military stance and attack to roll back communism. From what we learned the other day is that technologically we did have the missile superiority to substantiate the ability to use military forces. But were there any other nations where JFK's policies of peace versus war threatened the existence of other nations. You'll find that at the same time that we were having our Cuban Missile Crisis, there was a missile crisis occurring in the Middle East. Galen's organization, the conglomeration of old Nazi assets from Eastern Europe that had been used to fight the Russians, had surrendered itself to the OSS and the CIA. In 1962, it develops that the ex-Nazi scientists that developed the V-2 rockets that worked on chemical biological warfare are being brought to Egypt by Nasser, paid nice salaries to begin weapons programs for Egypt. And they parade through the streets their missiles to which they would deliver this. They had for warheads of this chemical weapons, biological weapons, and also nuclear weapons. That's not an atom bomb, but a warhead that would contain nuclear material like cobalt-60, strontium, plutonium, radioactive iodine, that if the missile hit the land, it wouldn't destroy great amounts of territory, but would make the land inhospitable. You couldn't live there. It would make an end to the Zionist dream of a homeland in Palestine. The consequence of this particular activity is that during the winter of 1963, the nation of Israel is dealing with the German government trying to put a stop to this flow of technology and individuals into Egypt. Ben-Gurion is the prime minister of Israel, Isar Halperin is his security chief, and they have meetings with the Adenauer government to try to stop this. The net result of this meeting is that the Adenauer government says that we really can't do anything about the actions of private German citizens. We don't control them once they leave the country. But we don't want to say we can't do anything. Maybe we can take away their passports. But of course, once they're in Egypt, their passport is no longer a problem. It's only a matter of those that have already gotten out. There is a flow of nuclear material that comes out of Germany to Egypt to start what they called radiation clinics to treat cancer. That's the cover for the material coming there. The question to be explored is, where did that nuclear material come from? How did it get there? The Germans weren't allowed to produce it. Where did it come from? Which nation gave it to them? I think that would shed some really interesting light upon how this crisis is also being caused. The Cold War is a real war. The truth is the first casualty for everybody involved. And as long as you continue to find deceit and deception with respect to the truth of what's really occurring, you're still in a Cold War. The Cold War hasn't ended. History has always told us that a Cold War will always end in a hot war. They're always just preliminaries. And so far, as you can see today, we still don't hear the truth about a lot of things that happened over 30 years ago. Old philosopher Emile Zola talks about the truth, what happens when you just press down the truth. Eventually, when it breaks forth, there's a lot of explosive power loosed in society. And we seek for the truth. We want to know the truth. We have to also understand that the truth which sets us free will also have a lot of shattering effects inside the social societal structure of which we must be aware. Looking back in time, not everybody shared the same points of view as Jack Kennedy with respect to the Russians and communism. I guess Jack Kennedy was reared on ideology. De Gaulle felt that ideology was just a propaganda tool, that nationalism was a much bigger force to be contended with. He felt that the goals and aims of Mother Russia was always expansion to the West and through and into the Middle East. It should be noted that the two nations most strongly opposed any type of move into the Middle East would be Israel and the United States. Which brings me to the last thing I have to say is threats. When people make threats against you, it's important to remember those threats. One of the reasons that Castro is held as a possible originator of the plot is because in the fall of '63 he makes a statement that if the President of the United States thinks that he could attempt to kill him, that he's not beyond having that happen to himself. Here in the in the 30s and in the 60s, Russians make a threat that they might try to destroy us. The basic peg legs of a free society are trust in government, trust in our legal systems, and trust in our economy. And every day we see this. And since 1963, we find that the people's trust of the government falls, trust in our legal systems. I don't have to take the law into my own hands. The courts will sort it out. All these institutions or trust in institutions begin to fail. And the last peg is our economy. That is the value of our dollar. How sound is our economy? I like to interpret this last statement by Lenin that the capitalist factories will produce the rope to hang the capitalists. I mean, what kind of product is produced from a capitalist factory? It's debt. And now the world swims in debt. It's a dollar debt. If anything happens to the faith and value of the American government, the soundness of that economy would be destroyed. I'll just conclude with one last statement. That would have been the last speech that Jack Kennedy made in Texas. That was that unless the Lord watch over the house, the watchman watcheth in vain. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Philip. If we could bring up the lights just briefly. While Wallace is getting ready, I'm glad that Philip touched on, he used the word fearful in the beginning. And with respect to what Russell said earlier, the last question that I ever asked to Harold Norman over the telephone, and I said, you don't have to answer this if you don't want to. I said, but given that what we've spoken about tonight has the ability to kind of rattle the official cage a little bit, I said, are you afraid? And if you've ever seen Harold Norman either in the trial with Bugliosi or if you've read his testimony, he was always very yes sir, no sir. And I said, are you afraid? And he said, yes sir, I am. So it's still out there. I'd also like to just make a comment. Philip made the point that he didn't think Officer Tippett was killed because he was having an affair over in that neighborhood. And I read that article when it came out this summer, and actually there was 3 contentions within the article. There was 3 suggestions. That was one of them. And as the person who wrote the article, I don't want you to think that's the only one. But I'm glad we got some debate going here. And certainly, I think we're going to have some time for Q&A. I hope we do. And when we do get done later on, please, let's interact. This is something that we all know about. I wasn't even going to suggest a question to that doctor that gave the talk on physics the other night because he was speaking to us. And it was wonderful, and I learned a great deal from it, but I'm not going to question him. But this is material that, please, feel free when we get to the Q&A, let's get something going here so we have something today and tomorrow to take home. Having said that, it is my great pleasure to introduce a fellow teacher, Wallace Milam, who is going to talk about some additional Warren omissions. And again, we've spoken about this, and I always find it fascinating, and I always find Wallace fascinating. So please welcome Wallace Milam.
First, I would like to speak about some medical evidence that you may not be aware of. It took quite a while for me to stumble upon this. There are many objections to the single bullet theory. I think people speak of trajectory, they speak of the condition of the bullet, they speak of the size of the relative sizes of the wounds in President Kennedy's body, entrance and exit. There is another, which I suppose that we know things and then we become aware of them perhaps at different times. And I mean by that, I think I really didn't appreciate this until a couple of years ago. And we can get this thing to, for what activates the remote is. That's very possible. There we go. Okay. Rewind works, forward doesn't. This could be a problem. I wonder what's going on over there. I want to go forward.
Staff to the rescue. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm pushing rewind and I want forward, or reverse and I want forward. I want the left one. It seems to be on. Yeah. At any rate, while this relates to Governor Connolly's wounds, something which to some extent has been rather taken for granted, particularly it relates to the wrist wound. As you know, we have discussed a discrepancy in the relative size of the wounds in Kennedy's back as described at the autopsy and the wound in Kennedy's throat as described before it was altered, as described by the emergency room physicians in Parkland Hospital. The Warren Commission made the wound in President Kennedy's back to be 4 by 7 millimeters. Assuming that it was roughly a rectangle, it would yield those areas. The House Assassinations Committee describes a very much larger wound. However, it has been explained to me that this includes not only perhaps the wound but the contused area around it, because the House Assassinations Committee's measurements are based upon interpreting a photograph, whereas the top number, 4 by 7, of course, is a result of observation of the body itself. The throat wound, we have no precise measurements for because it was altered. And Malcolm Perry made it to be 3 millimeters in circular. On another occasion, he called it 5 millimeters. Dr. Carrico referred to it as 5 millimeters. Assuming that it was 5 millimeters and was round, it would produce 19 square millimeters. At any rate, we can say that the throat wound in the front wound was smaller than the wound in President Kennedy's back or neck, and this has been cited as some evidence for the fact that obviously that exit wounds are normally larger, and this has been explained in various ways by a shored up collar. Has been offered as one explanation why the Warren Commission's exit wound in the front of the throat was so small, etc., etc. But there is a greater discrepancy than that in terms of entrance and exit. It doesn't relate to Kennedy, it relates to Connally. Now, of course, the official version is that the bullet struck Governor Connally in the dorsal side or the back of the wrist, passed through the wrist, produced a comminuted fracture of the radius, severed partially the radial nerve, did damage to some tendons, as we will see, and exited through the volar or underside of the wrist. Very few people have taken account of the sizes and so forth and of the damage along that path. We know, for example, that there were 7 or 8 pieces of bone produced from the operative report. We know that there were either 2 or 3 pieces of metal removed from the wrist, and a great deal, and there was also some fabric carried into the wrist. Some fibers from a coat were carried into the wrist also. Now, this is the operative report of Dr. Gregory. And I call your attention particularly to this area here, where there was a wound of exit. Originally, there were 10 spaces here. I believe that the original word there was laceration. He's speaking here about the volar or underside of the wrist. Indications are that at one time the word wound was there. Wound doesn't fit. There's enough space for the word laceration. It is my belief that originally he had written laceration, because when we compare sizes, the dorsal wound was 2 centimeters in length according to Gregory's operative report. When he testified for the first time for the Warren Commission, he made this 2 centimeters. In his second testimony, he described the wound as being 2.5 centimeters by 1/2 centimeter. At any rate, we can arrive at a figure of at least 2 centimeters according to the man who operated on the wrist for the dorsal wound. It was oblique. There was a loss of tissue and considerable contusion. All this comes from the operative report. In his Warren Commission testimony, Dr. Gregory referred to this as ragged and linear in nature. The damage was remarkably all on the dorsal side of the wrist. There were dark organic fibers in the wound. The radial nerve, superficial radial nerve, had been partially severed, and a tendon was transected completely. It later turns out that it was the extensor pollicis brevis, and to have that pronunciation about right. Yet the wound on the underside, the volar wound, the exit wound here, if you would, had no dimensions given in the operative report. In his March 23rd testimony, Gregory said that this was not more than a centimeter across. In his April 11th testimony, he referred to this wound's dimensions twice, once calling it 1.5 centimeters and the other calling it 1/2 centimeter. But there, at any rate, no matter which set of figures one accepts, the exit wound on the underside is considerably smaller than the entrance wound on the dorsal side of the wrist, but there is much more. The wound on the underside was described by Gregory in these terms at various times as a transverse laceration, which is one reason why I believe laceration is the word he had originally written in his operative report. He said it did not gape. It was a small laceration. It lay in the skin crease. It was an innocent-looking thing which had no characteristics of a wound of exit. And later he would say, as you examine this wrist casually, it was a very innocent-looking thing indeed. And it was not until it was probed that its true nature in connection with the remainder of the wound was evident. But when I read about his probing, I found that he found nothing in the probing. All the damage was done from the dorsal side of the wrist to the radius itself, to the bone itself. There was no damage on the underside of the wrist. In other words, there was no pathway that could be traced through the wrist. There was damage down to the radius. 15 years later, Dr. Bodden examined John Conley. He noted the scar from the wound on the dorsal side, but on the underside, as one might guess from such a tiny little wound, there was nothing left but a fine-healed surgical scar on the underside of the wrist. In other words, there was no sign of a wound, just the surgical scar, in which I believe 3 stitches were used to close. Dr. Robert Shaw always felt that only a fragment exited through the wrist of John Conley. Dr. Shaw always felt that the bullet did not pass through the wrist. He felt that the bullet struck the bone and that possibly only a fragment passed through the wrist. He felt that if the bullet had carried on through the wrist, the bone fragments which were found in the wound would have been carried out, at least some of them, there were 7 or 8, would have been carried out with the bullet as it exited. Remember, this bullet is tumbling. Remember, this bullet has to have struck the wrist base first, and the material deposited from this bullet has to have come from the base. The bullet has to have been tumbling. So we have a curious situation here in which a bullet tumbling, having already yawed and done a number of other things, has to strike the dorsal side of the wrist, produce a wound of some 1.5 to 2 centimeters in length, and emerge after doing considerable damage, creating bone, shattering bone, leaving behind some of its metal, has to emerge through a hole 1/3 or 1/4 the size of its entrance. Now, this is why I think it's so remarkable. In the case of the Kennedy wound, we have an exit wound in the front of the throat, if we want to follow the Warren Commission's version, which is somewhat smaller than the entrance wound, arguably. But here we have one measured by the doctor, which is not only somewhat smaller, but is remarkably smaller, and not only that, but had no characteristics of an exit wound according to the person who saw it. At first, Dr. Gregory did not associate this slit on the volar side of the wrist with the wound, because it had no characteristics of it. Dr. Gregory was sure that whatever missile caused the wound to Conley's wrist must have been deformed or irregular, or it would not have snagged and severed the nerves and tendons as it did. So we have an irregular missile. And he was sure, of course, that it hit base first. And how is that related to this? Of course, obviously, both Dr. Shaw and Dr. Gregory felt that the 2 fragments found in the front seat were more likely to have caused the wrist wound than CE-399. They were very obvious about that. I had occasion to talk with Dr. Shaw in 1992 in early June at a meeting of the Council of World Affairs here in Dallas. He attended, and he made these statements that he felt that the bullet didn't go through the wrist. He felt that the bullet had not struck someone else first. He felt that it was not a keyhole-shaped wound. Dr. John Latimer was the major presenter that night. Dr. Shaw, during the question and answer at the end, disagreed with Dr. Latimer completely about whether the bullet had struck someone else. So I had occasion to talk with Dr. Shaw over in the corner, as it were, for some 15 or 20 minutes. And he was quite certain that, in his view, the bullet had struck the wrist, ricocheted, had struck the bone, the great body of the bullet had ricocheted off the wrist and gone to the front seat of the car. Remember that bullet fragments were found within a few feet of where John Connolly was in that car. CE-399 was found somewhere, somehow. And the bullet fragments were found in much closer proximity to John Connolly at the time he was shot than anything else. He was quite certain that the fragments found in the front seat area were what had caused Governor Connolly's wrist wound, and that no bullet had absolutely penetrated the wrist. Well, you realize, of course, that if the bullet did not penetrate the wrist, if it did not exit through this tiny slit, which had no width, on the underside of the wrist, then the possibility of a whole bullet entering the thigh is non-existent. And the possibility of the bullet being on a stretcher which attended Governor Connolly at the hospital would appear to be non-existent also. This is one of the persons, I enjoyed Dr. DeMaio's comments particularly because he is one of the persons who has been trotted out most often by Gerald Posner, Martin Fackler, and others in defense of their findings concerning the single bullet theory. So I went to his textbook on what happens when bullets hit bone. And what he says is that when a bullet penetrates the bone, a number of bony fragments move forward in the direction of the bullet, and these act as secondary missiles. In this case, if that had occurred, those bony fragments, 7 to 8 of them, which were found in the wound, should have exited, some of them at least on the underside, along with the bullet, which allegedly exited there too, unless the bullet didn't exit there. Now, all of you are familiar with Arlen Specter's question, which he put to one doctor after another, which requires more assumptions than most of us can account. He applied that to Kennedy's neck wound. I have applied that to Connolly's wrist wound. Specter would probably have said this: I ask you to assume the following factors to be true. That a 6.5 millimeter Mannlicher Carcano bullet, having already passed through a human neck and a human torso, having already blown out 4 inches of a human rib, having already emerged through the anterior wall of a human chest while tumbling, then struck the dorsal side of the wrist base first, creating a ragged, oblique, contused wound 2 centimeters in length, then carried fibers from the coat into the wound, where it severed the radial nerve and the tendon of the extensor pollicis brevis muscle and produced a comminuted fracture of the radius, leaving 7 to 8 pieces of bone and 2 or 3 pieces of metal from the bullet just beneath the fractured radius. Assume further that the bullet then proceeded through the underside of the wrist, doing no damage to nerves, muscles, or tendon, leaving no bone, no metal, and no fibers, then emerged undeformed with its surface intact and only 2.5 grains of its mass loss through a 1 centimeter slit which had no characteristics of a wound of exit. Could this have been a wound of exit? And given those questions and phrased as it was, all of them would have had to have said yes.
Absolutely.
Given those hypotheticals and those presumptives. And remarkably, this question never came up. The question of the relative sizes of Connolly's wrist wound never came up, or it would have forced Dr. or Mr. Specter back to his laboratory of hypotheticals to create an even greater one, I guess. But I thought that you might be interested in the fact that I had never really appreciated this. I'd like to thank Dr. Robert Artwohl who for calling our attention to this in writing an article in JAMA in which he said, there's nothing unusual about an exit wound being smaller than an entrance wound, like the one in Kennedy's neck. Just look at the one in Connolly's wrist. So I did. And this is what I found. And I found it even more remarkable. Now, the rest of the things I have to say, we don't necessarily need any lights down. I would like to comment on some areas where I think the Warren Commission might have had opportunities. I think, for example, it's this personal opinion of mine that one of the keys to solving the case, which was in the hands of the authorities early on, were the comments of Sheriff Buddy Walters here in Dallas. and something which I'm sure you're familiar with. Buddy Walters' report, which he relied upon the Alan Sweat of the Dallas Police Department Intelligence, that Cubans were meeting at a house in 1326 Harlandale, North Harlandale, that Lee Oswald had been seen at this house and that those Cubans had been there a few days before the assassination and left a few days after. That was a matter of record in the first few days after the assassination. If it was followed up on, we have no record of it. But I think that, frankly, was a golden opportunity. I have asked, since the release of the Kennedy documents from HSCA, I have asked for any material relating to Harlandale, and so far we haven't found any. You can ask for individuals, Rodriguez and others from Alpha 66, and there are things. I think that was a golden opportunity. I think that you people who heard John Armstrong last night, regardless of what you thought of his presentation in terms of what it means, I don't think John knows what he thinks of his presentation yet, what it means. He's asking questions, as he should be. But anyone who heard that presentation and realizes that 31 years after the fact, one person can find those discrepancies in the childhood of Lee Harvey Oswald realizes that a great Warren Omission was the failure. They had within the facilities within days to have begun this investigation, to have found those discrepancies, and to have resolved them. And I certainly think that's a major omission. Clearly, I would think that the failure for the Warren Commission to examine the autopsy photographs and x-rays, if indeed they didn't, was a major omission. But I think it goes further than that. A true and fair investigation would have called the Parkland doctors to meet with the autopsy doctors and to have made a comparison, and the Parkland doctors should have been shown those autopsy photographs and x-rays. Also, the technology of the Zapruder film, which has been questioned now years after the fact. Very little effort was made to establish just exactly where Zapruder went after the assassination, every step that was pursued in the handling of that film, the technology of that. One of the things that has come to mind in recent times, certainly with the release of the House Assassinations Committee's documents, the Warren Commission did a pathetically inept job in handling Michael and Ruth Payne. And wait till you see some of the things that are coming out of the archives about the Paynes. That Minox camera was clearly stated to be Michael Payne's in the FBI report, which should have raised some questions. This is something that has troubled me. Some of you may have an answer to this. I'd like to hear it later if you do. The backyard photographs, Oswald's black outfit. Marina says she has no recollection of it. It's not in the property that was confiscated after the assassination. I just wondered about that. You would have thought that somebody would have asked that that be reproduced. I close by telling you that I do presentations in colleges, schools, universities around the country, a number of them each year, and I really enjoy the question and answer sessions. Most of all, because I've pretty well gotten my presentation down pat now after 400 plus times, and I enjoy the questions and answers. I could always anticipate there are certain questions that will always be asked. The third or fourth question will be about Lyndon Johnson being involved. What a negative tribute that every audience asks that all these years. And I always enjoy it because it's an ego trip, too. You can stand there and quote chapter and verse because you've had the questions before, and it really makes you feel like that you really know something, and you know you've had the questions before, so you can do citations that make you appear to be far more knowledgeable, I suppose, than you really are. And so I was unprepared at Arkansas State University about 10 years ago. This sophomore stood up and said, did anybody check to see if the gun had been fired recently? And my inclination to say, well, what it is, the real point is, what you're asking here, I don't know. Because I didn't know, and it turns out that nobody checked. Isn't that correct? It was a dirty gun, but as to when it had been fired lately, and if anybody actually performed one of those highly complex sniff tests to see if it had been fired lately. Apparently no one did, yes.
A dirty gun that left no prints or indications on the bag.
I can tell you, however, this microphone has not been fired recently.
So, and of course, finally, I would say this, and I'd like to apologize to these people up here who will recall this person's name and why I can't recall it now. I just used it a couple of weeks ago. Oswald's representation before the Warren Commission. The person from the Justice Department, what was his name, who was to look after Oswald's interests? Craig, yes, Walter Craig. The seldom heard Walter Craig. Yes. A legitimate, I wonder how that would have gone had Oswald had adversarial rights and Oswald's family been allowed to question witnesses also in an adversarial relationship. If somebody said if Mark Lane had gotten the job, well, the hearings would still be going on, but we might have gotten much closer to the truth. So when we start making a catalog of Warren omissions, we could be here for the remainder of this week, frankly. But those are some that I hear audiences ask about, and those are some that trouble me. Thank you.
Thank you again, Wallace. I had the opportunity to moderate a panel at COPA 5 weeks ago, and I got to introduce Wallace on that occasion, and he was speaking on the Martin Luther King assassination. So whereas there are very many of us, myself included, that, well, I know he was shot. Wallace is truly multidimensional, and I enjoyed his remarks today just as much as I did back on October 9th at COPA. A couple things that he said that just I'd like to say before I introduce Al Navis for 1 minute. He used the phrase, to begin within days. I think it's interesting that if we put it in perspective, the Warren Commission was created on November 29th. They called their first witness on February 3rd. That's 66 days. Now just imagine while you were watching that slow-speed chase on television on June the 17th, that if the LAPD had said, we're going to send out a pickup call for this guy and we want him interviewed within the next 9 weeks sometime. This Simpson fella. The other thing that was interesting when he talked about the Zapruder film, and Richard Trask in his book Pictures of the Pain goes through a great deal of the pedigree, but he does not answer Wallace's question. And he tells where everything went, but the most important thing that he doesn't say or doesn't allude to is that no copy of the Zapruder film ever went to the Dallas Police Department, who in fact were investigating the case. Secret Service got them, some got locked away, the FBI got them. The people investigating the case on that Friday were the Dallas Police, and they weren't allowed to see it. So for where we know it went or where we know it didn't go, the one thing we do know is that the authorities that should have gotten it didn't. With that, just prior to taking a few-minute break and returning with John Newman and myself, Al Navis has something he'd like to share with you very briefly, and I think it bears quite heavily on the conference.
Thanks, Walt. Our good friend and pioneering researcher, Penn Jones, Jr., is quite ill. Both Robert Groden and John Judge tried to visit Penn and Elaine Jones yesterday and were told by Elaine that he was too ill to see anyone. Kidney problems have become more serious to the point where this could very well be the end. They were forced to sell his book collection for $2,500, less than 5% of its value, to buy their mortgage to prevent them from being evicted. They need help. They need help now. If there are any people out there who are able to assist one of the original assassination researchers, if you could please send a check for any amount you can afford to John Judge at COPA. The address is on the inside back cover of your program book. And tell John that you wish the money to go to Penn. Finally, as many of you know, Penn Jones, for the past 31 years, has returned to Dealey Plaza every November 22nd for a moment of silence in respect for John F. Kennedy. Penn won't be there tomorrow. In his place, both Robert Groden and John Judge have agreed to temporarily take his place. It is a job that no one can fill. So if you could possibly attend tomorrow the memorial tribute following Mary Farrell's closing remarks as not only a memory to John Kennedy, but as a prayer for Penn Jones. Thank you.
Before you leave the lecture, can we right now drop some dollars?
Certainly. If anyone wants to contribute now, John will pass it on to Penn very quickly. Thanks, George Michael. Thanks, Walt. Thank you. Thanks, Steve. Thank you, Steve.
Also, please keep in mind, Penn Jones was one of the only person that published that early on, this close to Dallas, Texas, which took a lot of courage to do.
For all of you people who have never met Penn Jones, Steve?
Well, he's got a real good California name, so he's saying, we're going to grab the driveway.